You really, really see this later on in her writing, whether she's talking about Sarah or she's talking about Gypsy or these different kind of female characters she has. It definitely pulls from those early experiences.
She has been called rock and roll's high priestess, the woman in black chiffon who turned heartbreak into anthems the whole world sang along to. But behind every one of those songs was a real man, a real wound, a real night she still remembers in perfect, aching detail. Stevie Nicks has loved rock stars, producers, and even her own best friend's husband. She has buried lovers in silence and immortalized others in 3-minute masterpieces. Now, at 76 years old, she has finally said the words fans have waited 5 decades to hear. Out of every man who ever touched her heart, she has named the one she considers the great love of her life. And it might not be who you think. Lindsey Buckingham, the high school sweetheart. Before the shawls, before the Grammy stages, before Rhiannon turned her into a legend, Stevie Nicks was just a teenage girl at a party in the San Francisco Bay Area, watching a boy with a guitar sing a Buffalo Springfield song. His name was Lindsey Buckingham. They both attended Menlo Atherton High School, though they did not truly connect until that party, where Nicks asked to sing harmony with him. That single request would set off one of the most famous, most complicated love stories in music history. By the time they reunited years later at San Jose State University, the spark had turned into something deeper. They joined a band called Fritz together, and when that group dissolved, they decided to gamble everything on each other, both romantically and professionally. In 1973, they released the duo album Buckingham Nicks, a record that flopped commercially but caught the ear of a struggling British blues band called Fleetwood Mac, who needed a new guitarist, and as it turned out, got a singer as a package deal too. Before any of that, though, there was a real partnership built on real sacrifice. When Buckingham Nicks failed to sell, most couples would have walked away from music altogether. Instead, Nicks worked as a waitress and a house cleaner to help keep the two of them afloat, while Buckingham focused on writing and refining their sound. She has spoken about those lean years as some of the most formative of her life. A stretch where she learned exactly how much she was willing to sacrifice for a dream that had not yet paid off. That kind of shared struggle bonds two people in a way that fame later cannot replicate, which may be part of why, even after everything that happened next, neither of them has ever fully spoken of the other with indifference. So how does a fairy tale beginning collapse into one of the most devastating breakups in rock history? The answer is fame, pressure, and two enormous personalities crammed into one band. Once inside Fleetwood Mac, Buckingham and Nicks found themselves recording the album Rumours, while their relationship was actively falling apart in real time. Every band member was living through a romantic implosion simultaneously. Fleetwood was divorcing, the McVies were divorcing, and Nicks and Buckingham were breaking up after years together. Yet somehow, they all kept showing up to the same studio, pouring their pain into the same songs. Imagine that environment for a moment. 5 people, 1 control room, no escape from the person who just broke your heart. Because that same person is also the guitarist you need on the next track. There was nowhere to hide and no time to properly grieve, so the grief went straight into the music instead. It is part of why Rumours still sound so raw nearly 50 years later. Nobody was performing a breakup. They were living one on tape in real time. That emotional honesty became the album's secret weapon. Listeners did not just hear polished performances, they heard resentment, longing, regret, and unresolved love bleeding through every harmony. Few records have ever captured relationships unraveling with such brutal authenticity, which helps explain why Rumours continues resonating across generations even today. That is the origin of tracks like Dreams, which Nicks reportedly wrote in about 10 minutes on a bed in a rented mansion studio, and Go Your Own Way, Buckingham's blistering, accusatory response to her. Two people, one breakup, two completely different songs about it, both becoming some of the biggest hits of the decade. Decades later, Buckingham would admit publicly that there were years he was not over her, and even suggested she might never have been fully over him either. Nicks herself has called him her first love, and her love for all time, even while insisting they could never actually be together again. But if Lindsey Buckingham was the love that shaped her, he was not the only man competing for her heart in those wild, chaotic years. J.D. Souther, The Brief Encounter. In the early 1970s, Los Angeles was a playground for musicians on the edge of superstardom, and one of the city's most magnetic figures was singer-songwriter J.D. Souther, closely tied to the Eagles and a key architect of the entire Laurel Canyon sound. Nicks and Souther crossed paths during this era, and while their romance did not last long, it left a mark. Their connection was brief but intense, unfolding inside a music scene that ran almost entirely on male ambition, male egos, and male gatekeeping. For a young woman trying to be taken seriously as a songwriter, rather than dismissed as somebody's girlfriend, that environment was brutal. It is widely understood that this period, moving through rooms full of powerful men who assumed she was there because of who she was dating, rather than what she could write, hardened something in Nicks. It sharpened her determination to be recognized as an artist in her own right. So could it be that some of her most fiercely independent lyrics trace back to this exact moment in her life? Many who have studied her catalog believe so. The steely, guarded quality that shows up in later songs about self-protection and refusing to be defined by a man did not come from nowhere. It came from years of proving herself in rooms where she was constantly underestimated, and the Souther chapter was one of the earliest lessons in exactly how hard she would have to fight. Los Angeles in that era was small, in a way people forget. The Eagles, the Byrds, Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Browne, and Fleetwood Mac all orbited the same handful of clubs and canyon houses, which meant everybody knew everybody's business, and everybody's breakups became public property within days. Being linked to Souther, even briefly, meant Nicks was suddenly discussed in terms of who she was dating, rather than what she was writing, a pattern that would follow her for years. She has spoken since about how frustrating it was to walk into a room full of talented men and immediately be sized up as somebody's girlfriend, rather than a songwriter with her own catalog worth taking seriously. That frustration did not fade quietly. It hardened into the fierce, guarded independence that fans would eventually hear echoed across her entire solo career. Mick Fleetwood, The Tumultuous Affair. Now here is where things get genuinely scandalous, because the next man to break her heart was not some outside rock star. He was her own band leader. During the making of Rumours, while Nicks and Buckingham were unraveling and Mick Fleetwood's marriage was collapsing at the same time, Nicks and Fleetwood began a secret affair. Think about that for a moment. John and Christine McVie were also divorcing, Fleetwood's marriage was falling apart, and Nicks and Buckingham had just split, so nearly the entire band was living through overlapping heartbreak at once. Now the band's own drummer and its lead singer had crossed a line that could have destroyed the group entirely. The affair was emotionally chaotic by nature. Fleetwood was still legally married, Nicks was still raw from her breakup with Buckingham, And every single day, the two of them had to sit across from Buckingham in the studio and pretend the tension in the room was purely creative. It was not. That churning, barely contained emotional wreckage is baked directly into the DNA of Rumours, an album that became one of the best-selling records of all time, precisely because 5 people turned their real-life devastation into something the entire world could feel. Picture the sheer nerve it took to carry on that affair inside a band that small. 5 people, 1 tour bus, 1 studio, and Nicks and Fleetwood were managing an affair while still performing alongside Buckingham night after night. When the truth eventually surfaced, it did not just complicate the band's internal dynamics. It added an entirely new layer of tension to a group that was already running on fumes and heartbreak. And yet, the album they made in the middle of it all went on to sell tens of millions of copies worldwide. So how do 2 people survive an affair like that and still end up in a band together for 50 years? They did not stay lovers. The romance eventually burned out, as affairs forged in crisis so often do. But instead of destroying their relationship entirely, Nicks and Fleetwood transitioned into something rarer, a deep, enduring working friendship and creative partnership that has outlasted nearly every other relationship on this list. He became one of the most trusted men in her life, proof that even the messiest beginnings can eventually settle into something stable. Decades later, the two of them still spoke about each other with genuine warmth, a testament to how much history, good and bad, they had managed to survive together. But Fleetwood Mac's inner circle was not the only place her heart kept getting tangled. Soon, a much bigger name entered the picture: Don Henley, the Rockstar romance. By the late 1970s, Stevie Nicks was one of the biggest female voices in rock, and across town, Don Henley of the Eagles was arguably the genre's biggest male voice. When 2 megastars like that collide, it is never going to be a quiet, low-key romance, and it was not. Their relationship was passionate, on again, off again, and played out largely in the eye of an industry that was watching both bands at the peak of their commercial power. But it also carried a private weight that Nicks would not speak about publicly for decades. During their relationship, Nicks became pregnant. In interviews she gave decades later to Billboard, to Rolling Stone, and to CBS News Sunday Morning, Nicks confirmed that she made the decision to end that pregnancy. She has said plainly that Fleetwood Mac was only 3 years into its meteoric rise at that point, and that becoming a mother in the middle of that chaos would have, in her own words, destroyed the band. She has also confirmed that had she given birth to a daughter, she would have named her Sarah, tying that private grief directly to one of Fleetwood Mac's biggest singles. Nicks has said the pregnancy became public knowledge in a way that hurt her, telling Rolling Stone that Henley was the one who let the story out. Even with the hurt that caused, she has described their overall relationship fondly, calling it a fun one, while also being blunt about why it could never have gone the distance. In her own retelling, the Eagles were an even bigger juggernaut than Fleetwood Mac at that moment, and nobody in that band, including Henley, was in any place to settle down and start a family. She has said she knew instinctively that raising a child would have landed almost entirely on her shoulders, and she was not willing to take on that responsibility while also carrying an entire band's commercial future on her back. So what does it say about the price of fame when a woman has to choose between motherhood and the band that made her a legend? It says everything about the era Nicks came up in, and the impossible math so many women in the industry were forced to do. She has never framed the decision as easy, but she has also never expressed regret, describing it publicly as the right choice for the life she was living at the time. The Henley relationship ultimately could not survive that strain, along with the simple reality that two rock stars at that level of fame rarely have room for anyone but the music. Even so, the two of them stayed close enough over the years that bitterness gave way to mutual respect, including performing together when Fleetwood Mac was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Her next major romance, though, would not just shape her heart. It would shape the entire sound of her solo career. Jimmy Iovine, the producer turned lover. In the early 1980s, Stevie Nicks was preparing to step outside Fleetwood Mac for the first time and release a solo album. The man brought in to produce it was Jimmy Iovine, a rising hotshot producer who would later go on to co-found Interscope Records and Beats Electronics. What started as a professional collaboration on her debut solo record, Belladonna, quickly became personal. Their romance blurred the line between the studio and the bedroom in a way that ended up defining an entire era of her career. Iovine was deeply involved in shaping tracks like Stop Draggin' My Heart Around, her duet with Tom Petty, and later Edge of 17, the song that became her signature solo anthem. Working that closely with someone, falling for him in the same rooms where the music was being built, meant her personal life and her professional sound became almost impossible to separate. Think about the pressure baked into that dynamic. Every vocal take, every late night in the studio, every decision about which songs made the final cut was happening between two people who were also falling for each other outside the booth. That is an extraordinarily high-stakes way to fall in love, because a bad breakup does not just cost you a relationship, it could cost you the album that launches your entire solo career. Somehow, it worked. Eventually, the romance ended, the way so many of her relationships did, under the weight of two demanding careers pulling in different directions. But unlike some of her other breakups, this one did not end in bitterness. Nicks and Iovine maintained mutual respect and continued to speak highly of each other's influence for years afterward, a rare example of a romance that dissolved without torching the professional bond underneath it. Iovine went on to build one of the most powerful careers in the music business, and Nicks has never shied away from crediting those early sessions together as some of the most creatively important of her life. Her next chapter, though, would have nothing to do with rock star chemistry at all. It would come from the deepest grief of her life. Kim Anderson, the grief-stricken union. If you only remember one story from this list, let it be this one, because it is the strangest and saddest chapter in Stevie Nicks's entire romantic history. Robin Snyder Anderson had been Nicks's best friend since they were teenagers, long before Fleetwood Mac, long before any of the fame. In the early 1980s, Robin was diagnosed with leukemia and given only months to live. To make an already devastating situation even more heartbreaking, Robin was pregnant at the time of her diagnosis. Doctors delivered her son, whom she named Matthew, prematurely, and Robin died just days later, according to Nicks's own retelling of events. Nicks was named the baby's godmother, and in the fog of that grief, she made a decision that stunned everyone around her. Just months after Robin's death, in 1983, Nicks married Robin's widower, Kim Anderson. So why would a woman at the absolute height of her fame marry a man she was not even in love with? By her own account, it was not romance driving the decision at all. It was grief and a desperate need to feel like she was doing something to protect baby Matthew, the child of the woman who had known her since she was 14 years old, long before the famous Stevie existed. Nicks has said outright that she and Anderson did not marry because they were in love. They married because they were grieving, and it was the only way either of them knew how to cope. She has since called the decision a terrible terrible mistake, and the marriage collapsed after only about 8 months. The divorce ended their romantic relationship, but it did not end her bond with Matthew. Nicks has described herself as committed to being a presence in his life, holding on to memories and mementos of Robin to give him when he was ready, and the two eventually did reconnect years later. She has said she kept home videos, photographs, and a book she wrote in the year Robin died, all set aside for the day Matthew was old enough to want them. It remains one of the rawest, most human stories in her entire history. Proof that even rock legends make impulsive, heartbroken decisions just like everybody else. What makes the story even stranger is how openly Nicks has admitted the marriage was never really about romantic love at all. It was about control, or the illusion of it, in the middle of a loss so sudden and so cruel that marrying her best friend's widower felt, at the time, like the only way to hold on to a piece of Robin that was still alive in the world. Many of Nicks's closest friends reportedly tried to talk her out of it, and several people close to her refused to even attend the wedding, convinced she had lost her mind in her grief. Looking back, Nicks herself has essentially agreed with them, admitting she probably had. But after all of these relationships, the fame, the affairs, the grief, there is one name Stevie Nicks keeps returning to. One man she has called, in her own words, the great of her life. Joe Walsh, the great love. By the early 1980s, Stevie Nicks had already survived Lindsey Buckingham, Don Henley, and a grief-fueled marriage. And then, in 1983, at a hotel bar in Dallas, she met Joe Walsh. Walsh, the guitarist known for his work with the James Gang, and, notably, the Eagles, the very band that had already given her Don Henley, entered her life that night. And by her own description, it was something close to instant. She has said she saw him from across the room, without her glasses, walked straight to him, and sat down beside him. And that was it. In her own retelling, she has called their connection the perfect, complete, crazy pair. What made this relationship different from the others was the sense of equality. This was not a producer shaping her sound, not a bandmate she had to see every day in the studio, not a man she married out of duty. This was, by nearly every account she has given, a genuine creative and emotional partnership, one where both of them wrote music for each other and understood each other on a level few outside partners ever reached. She worked alongside him on his 1985 album, The Confessor, and their relationship, on and off, lasted roughly 2 to 3 years. But it came with a devastating complication. Both Nicks and Walsh were deep in active addiction at the time, and substances ultimately consumed the relationship. Nicks has been remarkably candid about just how serious it got, describing the two of them as busy superstars who were doing far too many substances, essentially, in her words, a couple on a path toward destruction. So if the connection was this powerful, what finally tore them apart? Survival. Nicks has said plainly that they had to break up, or they believed they would die. It was Walsh who ultimately ended things in 1986, reportedly getting on a plane to put literal distance between them, because friends say he feared one of them would not survive the relationship and the other would be left unable to save them. Nicks has admitted it took her years to get over it, adding that there was no other man in the world for her during that period, a statement she made even decades later. And here is the detail that changes everything. In a widely cited 2008 interview with Q magazine, Nicks was asked point-blank to name the love of her life. She answered without hesitation, Joe Walsh. In that same interview, she drew a striking distinction, saying that Lindsey Buckingham was probably the man who loved her the most in her entire life, but that her own great, great love was Walsh, adding that she fell for him in much the same way Buckingham once fell for her. She has echoed some version of that sentiment in other interviews too, once telling People magazine there was nothing more important than Joe Walsh. Not her music, not her songs, not anything. And that they had to break up, or she believed they would die. Nicks memorialized that connection directly in her 1985 song, Has Anyone Ever Written Anything for You?, a track she wrote for Walsh, and later dedicated in her own liner notes to him and to his late daughter as well. It is a rare example of her naming her inspiration almost outright, rather than burying it in metaphor the way she did with so many of her other relationships. Despite the breakup, despite the addiction that nearly destroyed them both, the bond never fully disappeared. The two eventually settled into recovery separately and maintained a long-term friendship built on genuine affection. When Walsh was asked in later years about being called the great love of Stevie Nicks' life, he responded with humility, calling her a great songwriter, a great singer, and a great person, and confirming that the time they spent together shaped both of their music profoundly. It is worth noting, though, that Walsh's own feelings do not quite match hers in intensity. Love-inspiring art. Step back and look at the whole picture, and something becomes impossible to ignore. Stevie Nicks' entire catalog is essentially a map of her heart. Dreams and Go Your Own Way chart the collapse of Buckingham. Sarah carries the quiet grief of the baby she never had with Henley. Stop Dragging My Heart Around and Edge of 17 were built in rooms she shared with Iovine. Even songs never explicitly tied to Walsh carry the emotional residue of a love so consuming, she said nothing else mattered. So why does her music still hit this hard, decades later, for people who were not even alive during any of these relationships? Because Nicks never hid behind metaphor for the sake of it. She turned specific, personal heartbreak into something universal enough that anyone who has ever lost someone, chosen a career over a relationship, or loved someone they could not keep, hears their own story inside hers. Watch her perform Landslide today compared to decades ago. And the difference is obvious. The song has not changed. She has. Every year adds new perspective, new grief, new gratitude, and audiences can hear all of it layered into a single performance. That honesty is exactly why so many artists across genres cite her as an influence, not just for the sound, but for the willingness to be that exposed in public, over and over again for 50 years straight. Younger stars working in confessional songwriting today, whether they realize it or not, are walking a path Nicks carved out decades ago. When writing about your own abortion, your own affairs, and your own grief was still considered far too risky for a woman in the spotlight. It is worth sitting with just how many different kinds of love this one woman lived through. A teenage romance that turned into a professional empire. A brief fling that hardened her resolve. A secret affair with her own bandmate. A pregnancy she chose not to carry, tied forever to one of her most beloved songs. A producer whose fingerprints are all over her signature sound. A marriage born entirely out of grief rather than love. And finally, a connection so consuming that she has spent decades calling it, without hesitation, the greatest love of her life. Most people are lucky to experience even one of those chapters. Stevie Nicks lived through all of them, wrote a song about nearly everyone, and somehow kept standing at the microphone through all of it. At 76 years old, Stevie Nicks has spent decades circling back to the same answer whenever anyone dares to ask directly. Out of every man who ever broke her heart, built her sound, or married her out of grief, one name rises above the rest as the great, great love of her life: Joe Walsh. Whether you believe the real answer is actually the boy she met in high school, the guitarist she has said loved her more than any man ever has, is a debate fans will probably never stop having. But when Stevie Nicks herself has been asked point-blank, in her own words, the verdict has stayed remarkably consistent. If this deep dive into the real love story behind rock and roll's most iconic songs kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe for more untold histories of the stars who shaped the soundtrack of our lives.